I'm Nicola Talent and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. The story this week that you were writing about the gangs in Limerick and their board of governors really tells us one thing, and it is how they have emerged into very sophisticated organised crime gangs from really where they started as feuding, brawling, murderous drug dealers.
Yeah, I mean, like, to get the detail was great. It kind of shows you how there's a kind of a whole layer of, I suppose, illicit business people, people who are kind of, they're able to control the logistics and handle the management. Because when you think about the millions that are being, generated by the drugs trade, that you do need people with a certain level of skill, that you're not going to descend into the mayhem that we saw like in during the 2000s when, the feud going on between the Keane Collopys and the McCarthy Dundons. What is it? 17 people thought to have been killed and several people serving life sentences, as a result of the various murders that went on. 2 innocent people, among those killed. Some of those killed were very minor criminals and certainly didn't deserve what they got.
When you looked into Limerick in those days, you saw a lot of these people were still living in council estates. Many of them still are. They didn't sort of stand out as having wealth, other than maybe having turned their house into a fortress with, bullet-resistant windows and maybe large gates or something. But there was something that looked so unsophisticated about them. Violent, yes, absolutely, but unsophisticated. And it was like as if the violence took precedent over the making of the money.
Yeah, look, I mean, there was people, it was almost blood feuds rather than, business disagreements. And it was more about trying to be the big dog on the block, just for the pure sake of it. It was just crazy macho stuff, to be honest. I mean, even back then there was, kind of a more shadowy senior tier that were kind of working at it. You had, the various people based in, surrounding County Limerick who were really calling the shots and who were quite serious, some of whom went on trial, some of who didn't. These are people who were able to operate international import-export companies. So while the likes of the Dundons were running around the place killing people, and, the Collopys running around the place killing people in themselves, there wasn't, there were some people who were able to keep their eye on the ball and keep making money. And I think what we got from this recent cab case was a little insight into who these new board of governors are. And some of them have come directly from the original gangs, the likes of Eds McCarthy, who's, effectively became the leader of the McCarthy Dundon faction. You've written about him before as well. And the fact that,
of course, to Thomas Bomber Cavan.
Yeah, I mean, he was there in Birmingham. So, I mean, you have a direct link. I mean, it's 3 degrees of separation from the Kinahans to Eds McCarthy from Moy Ross in Limerick. And then I think what not surprised me, but what I suppose confirmed for me about this was that these guys essentially are working together. Like, what were, deadly rivals have to a large extent have put this behind them, and they're just getting on with making money. They're dealing with these intermediaries. And on the face of it, it certainly looks like they're all willing to do business. I mean, you have one guy, who's pals with Eds McCarthy, and then he's collated in a pub in Rathkeale meeting with Christy Keane and his trusted lieutenant.
Must be arch rivals. Isn't that really what stands out for us since the advent of drugs hitting the north? In the same way, you have the loyalists and the Republican paramilitaries actually sometimes working together. Sometimes, when it comes to money, they put all their differences aside. But explain this and why you described these men that we have named. You've named in your piece in this Underworld this weekend, and were named in this CAB document as a board of governors.
Well, it's the best way to describe them, really. These are the people that control, to some extent, the international connections. So you had like Shane Curtin, who up until recently, we could only, if we did refer to him, it was as a motor dealer. But he's been exposed pretty much by this case against Bawn Motors as being a key player in the importation of drugs from continental Europe and the UK. Alongside him, you have John O'Donoghue, who a businessman from Rathkeale. he would have been part of what would have been seen as the Rathkeil Rovers one time. We managed to do stories about him more recently because he did get a drugs conviction, although got a suspended sentence. He was caught by the NCA on tape setting up a cannabis deal. So like he's an associate of Eds McCarthy, and he was one of these guys that were alleged to have direct control of Bone Motors, along with Mike Nash, who is also another motor dealer based in Newcastle West and was very close to Shane Curtin. So those three.
And Bone Motors sits at the centre of this story and this document by the courts, which is the sort of the judgment, I think, from the Criminal Assets Bureau case. And it starts in 2019 when the cab officers cut their way into Bone Motors in Limerick City, and they remove 115 high-end cars. And people may remember that because at the time it was the biggest single asset seizure, I think, in the history of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and maybe it remains that way.
Yeah, it was certainly it certainly on the face of it at the time, it was definitely the biggest physical operation. I think that the actual value of the cars probably ended up being slightly less, I think, than was initially touted. And what the cab case, it was actually heard last December. And basically all the cars had since been sold off. And it's what they do now with the Criminal Assets Bureau. They seize valuable things like cars that are going to depreciate in value.
Yeah.
Well, they used to depreciate in value. There was a little blip in that recently. Like they will sell them off and then and put the cash into account. And so it's the cash that's actually, it was the order of the Seizure Act this time.
That cash essentially on reserve.
Yeah. And like it was a very complex case. You had Shane Curtin and Mike Nash and others that were claiming part ownership of different cars, and that they had different ways of knowing whose cars were which, and that they had pooled resources. And there was kind of it was the cab case was that there was a deliberate kind of attempt not to leave any records, and there was literally no real proper bookkeeping or anything like this, and no way of showing really who owned which car. Which cars?
Curtin put himself on record in this case because I recall when this started to come before the courts, the Criminal Assets Bureau case, there was a number of individuals named, and Curtin actually came forward to say, actually, sorry, I own some of these. So he actually sort of put himself in this, but for reasons that will be explained in this judgment.
Yeah, I mean, he could come to regret that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was there was a number of people kind of were claiming ownership, and like the cab went to great lengths. I mean, they got various statements from different people who had bought cars legitimately. They were buying cars for $8,000, $9,000, and had even got finance. And it even appeared there was a possible fraud going on with some of the financing. Like it was raised about how there was a particular finance company and some of the information being sent to it didn't actually reflect what was going on the ground. But like cab went, and tracked down a lot of people who had bought cars or traded in cars, and were asked who did they deal with, and these men were the people that were seen as the controlling interest, and they very much were making the case, which was accepted by the judge in the end, that this was a vehicle literally set up to launder money from the drug gangs. And it's not just one of them; it was both sides. So it wasn't like as if it was the McCarthy Dundons had got an edge in ahead of their rivals. It was both sides. It was the Keens are directly linked into this as well.
We've heard before that cars are used as currency in the drug business, and that came up in the case of Liam Byrne from Raleigh Square, who is currently fighting extradition back to the UK on weapons charges. But around 2016, when his company LS Active Car Sales was raided, he was in business there with Sean McGovern, wanted here for murder, and in Dubai along with his pal Daniel Kinahan. But it was literally described during that cab case that they were using the cars as currency. So they were using them as payment for drugs. But in this case, were the cars purely bought with drug money and then sold on in order to legitimise the money? Or were the cars being used to transport any drugs? Or was it just simply a business that was set up to make dirty money good?
Yeah, well, the cab's case was that it was set up to make dirty money good. That these cars were being bought supposedly at auction in the UK and then being sold at whatever price here. But there was no there was no money trail from the UK where necessarily the cars were bought. There was evidence heard that there was something like €2 million worth of vehicles were bought from a car firm in the UK, and there was an affidavit from an English officer to say that the two directors of the firm were both well-known criminals. I mean, there was £2 million worth of vehicles bought, and the place doesn't have a premises.
Right.
So that kind of gives you an idea that it was very much, it was just a total setup to move assets around. Now, there's also alleged that there was known criminals, like, from Limerick, who had access then to the car. So the guys were able to use it like a little, I don't know, rent-a-car service
They weren't
as
done
well.
for benefit in kind, no?
Yeah, well, I doubt. Yeah, well, I'm sure it was, they reflected that in their tax returns every year. But it was very much a kind of a nice, convenient way, isn't it, to kind of keep changing your vehicle and
like they felt that. Firstly, they were untouchable. I mean, this Bowen Motors company was sitting smack bang in the middle of Limerick City quite openly. I mean, you can't hide cars. It's not like Rolex watches that can go into a drawer or anything like that. But so they were very openly doing it. And the cars were then making their way into the legitimate economy. So the people who were buying the cars from Bowen Motors were like you or I.
Yeah, it was just regular people. I mean, it's in a prime retail spot.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think it's coming in from the Tipperary direction. It was along that road. I mean, it was. I do remember, like, at the time when I heard about the raids, it was pretty spectacular. Like, there was a huge number of officers involved, and of course, there was the photographs of the I don't know, I guess it was, guards in tactical gear with consoles and plenty of sparks going through the fencing and all the rest.
Yeah.
And some of these kind of the main principals that were controlling the company, there was one or two of them were actually on site at the time, and they weren't apologetic. They were complaining to the police about, you can't take this and you can't do that, and
they fought hard,
and they have done, yeah, but they lost.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I think, like, I suppose what I found most interesting was just the sheer kind of width of the networking that went on. And it brings in everybody from my old pals in the, connected to the Dead Zoo gang, the fellas stealing the rhino horns, all the way over to Birmingham and Bomber Kavanagh, car firms in Northern Ireland, car firms in Northumberland, I think it is, and other places in the UK. All these guys are traveling back and forth between the UK and Ireland and Northern Ireland and continental Europe on a regular basis. They're all people who have, businesses, possibly legit. Some of them are legitimate businesses set up. They're well able to run affairs. I mean, and they've all been kind of linked back to actually an interest in pony trotting and sulky racing. And this is how some of these guys met. So you have people from, in a way, disparate backgrounds, like, for instance, the Rackheelers, and then the more hardcore, gangsters from Limerick City. And then some of these, motor dealers who might necessarily have been hardcore criminals as such. And then there are other people involved then who wouldn't come from any of those backgrounds and would have come from, potentially respectable, they did actually come from a respectable family background and found themselves, working for these people. So it's a real insight into how that kind of layer, like, the infrastructure nearly of gangland crime, people like that Haulier, Thomas Marr, and these guys who operate for 20, 30 years, and we rarely get to hear about them.
They're like as if they feel like they're not, they feel, okay, they're hiding in the shadows, I suppose, but they feel like they're not the dangerous ones because they're not the guys who are actually, ordering the hits. They're actually just going about their business. And usually, especially the ones in the transport, they're transporting anything. They don't care whether it's human beings or drugs or cars or whatever. We look at the car industry there for a little while and we work out, what was so attractive to the car industry. And I recall back around this time, or certainly 2020, 21, the Criminal Assets Bureau had worked out that there was at least 100 dodgy car dealers in Dublin alone, in a particular part of West Dublin. They were seeing more and more that the car industry was being used as a laundry facility for organised crime. I think next on the list was sort of barbers and beauticians, and these were the sort of businesses that they were washing their funds through. But the car industry, so there was a lot of cars coming in from the UK. There was, value as such seen in buying a car from the UK. I think the car I had before this one, a sports Mini, I brought in from the UK. And there was no... something changed in between then and now with the what you had to pay on it. You certainly had to pay something to bring those cars in, but you were still getting value, and you're no longer
Yeah, there was VRT.
VRT.
Like it was you had to basically pay the taxes you would have paid on the vehicle if you'd bought it in Ireland, and so it depends on the type of car and etc. So some cars were good value and others weren't. But now, because the UK are no longer part of the EU, it's a whole different ballgame.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why we've seen more cars coming in from Japan.
Yeah.
Which ironically is why we've seen more of the kids out joyriding again, because there's no problem with cars being stolen in Japan. So these cars are arriving. A lot of them are arriving without any kind of disabling mechanisms in them. So the kids are able to start the car with just a screwdriver, and off they go, causing huge damage, by the way, to the cars.
We're back to putting the finger in the dam to try and stop any of this, really, aren't we? In a way, like, you close off the UK. But also, I suppose, cars from the point of view of, if you need to spend money, most of us don't. Most of us are constantly trying to save money. But drug dealers need to spend money, and they need to kind of move their money into the legitimate economy and have something that is valuable to resale. And that's why jewellery and the likes of it are, are something that they like. They also like to wear that kind of thing. Some of them aren't highbrow enough to look at fine art, but that has also been used by criminals over the years. But cars appear to have been this classic kind of item that was sought by them. They like to drive fast cars and expensive cars, but there also is a lot of money there that you can exchange and get into the legitimate economy in just one item. So you bring in, say, a high-end Mercedes or something like that, and you're talking 100,000 is going into the legitimate economy in one sale.
Yeah, I mean, if you can buy, a high-end car in the UK for 100,000 or even 150,000, whatever, and there are those cars, and you bring it back and you sell it here. Someone gets a good deal and gets it for 110. Then you say, you're making money that way. I mean, it doesn't really hold up when they go at it. They say, well, where did you get the 150 in the first place?
Yes, when you go back to square one, there's a problem.
They do argue about it. And to some extent, it makes it more difficult because it's cross-jurisdictional and all the rest, and it's harder to trace the money trail. But I suppose, Bone Motors weren't going for the high end; they were going for very much for volume. Mm-hmm. It was in Judge Owens's judgment. Like he points out that in 2017, their recorded sales receipts were 5.3 million. And were 8 million the following year in 2018, which is, as he put it, a remarkable success. And I mean,
touch.
Well, it also gives you an idea of what the guys in Limerick are making, if this is what's going through, going through one laundering facility.
Yeah.
And I mean, the rule of thumb used to be, wasn't it? I think something like if you get 60-40, like if you lose 60% to make 40% legitimate, you're doing well.
Yeah.
Which in terms of you're paying legitimate tax sounds a bit high. And that if you get up to 50-50, like you're at the top end. So I mean, if you've set up a car company to launder your cash, and if you're losing 80, if you're losing only 20% of your money, you're doing really well. So I mean, going from 3 million euro worth of sales. I mean, this is a place with a porta cabin, really. I mean, it was in a prime spot. But like it certainly wasn't like, one of these slick car dealerships with big glass frontage and coffee machines and little lounge to wait in.
Those that are totally legitimate have been there for years, and some of them are family businesses that have passed their way down the generations. I mean, certainly I know the guy I buy my cars off and who is completely legitimate and so trusting and trustworthy would say he has to work goddamn hard. You know what I mean? It is it's not easy money in car sales business. And he would also say that you only have to look at some of these guys, they're opening new, and all of a sudden they have like £1 million worth of assets sitting on their forecourt.
Yeah.
And it's pretty obvious in a way. But I suppose they had, and probably still have, a little bit of strength in their numbers, because there's so many of them. If you consider that there's an estimated 100 in the West Dublin area alone, car dealers. I'm not talking about some of the bigger legitimate firms, obviously, but some of the car dealers. Is the resources there to go after each one of them? Probably not.
Well, like this is a case in point. It was complex, and I mean, it was like I think it was more than There was more than the 111 cars initially, but some of them were quickly found to be not belonging to the company, and people were able to say, "Oh, look, that's actually mine." I mean, even in the case of the Shane Curtin, there was 2 vehicles that were seized from his house, one belonging to his wife and a Ford Ranger that belonged to him. And the judge decided, look, there was no evidence that these were bought with any criminal cash, so they're going to get returns, the value of those 2 vehicles back to them. But like it's a difficult. I mean, anyone, if the last time I bought a car, like, in terms of like just filling in the forms and all the rest of it, there's a little bit of work to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine now if you have, somebody with 100 cars, how much paperwork is going to be involved. And then if they're being imported, from the UK.
And untangling that for police
and possibly then through Northern Ireland, like as an added step. It just gets complex, and they have to do that, and they have to do it for all 111 cars
with a level of proof that is top standard for the court system.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of work. I mean, there was a lot of work, and I suppose in a way, when you look down at the figure, then like what essentially was seized was worth just over 800,000, which you kind of think, well, that's not a lot, but like at the same time, it's I'd say it was hugely disruptive to the drug gangs. Like, I mean, it must have been. I mean, I'm sure they're still making money, but. Like we've seen Operation Glacier, I think was this one. And we've seen some people coming to court just in the last couple of weeks. You had one guy, Dermot Plum McManus, who was mentioned in this affidavit, but he was previous in the Special Criminal Court earlier this year. And he was caught with a couple of €1,000 in his house. And again, that was part of, you remember, there was quite a large number of raids in different parts of Limerick at the time and in the county. And the army search teams were brought in to help. And so this was kind of, it would have been in parallel to the Bowen Motors investigation. So, I mean, it's kind of broken up how they can, hide their money. And it's, they're going after them, like, in that sense.
And I suppose always the Criminal Assets Bureau would say that, they aren't in existence to make the state money. Actually, they're in existence to disrupt the criminal gangs, and the value of that disruption a figure cannot exactly be put on it. This investigation, the uncovering of this Bowen Motors as a money laundering element of the Limerick gangs, has surely thrown up further intelligence and information about how they operate and who's involved, like some of the people that you have described. And obviously these sort of board members, as you call them, board of governors in this, could have been carrying on regardless. The 800,000 is one element of this investigation, and just one element. Shane Curtin, his background, was he a scrap dealer? Is that my imagination?
Well, he's involved in the motor trade, and he has, I think he might have been. He was more Newcastle West was where he'd been based. Along with Mike Nash, and and Nash is the guy. He's the fella who, after these raids, then it would have been Christy Keane's son, took over the same premises to have where he was running his car company at the time. If you remember, it's I think a story you did at the time.
That's right, we did, and we went down to throw an eye over that premises because Mark Nash had obviously come on the radar because of this investigation into Bowen Motors and this cab case. And sure enough, Kieran Keane Jr. was kind enough to show up that day at the premises, and that was obviously a significant link then we were able to make between this, who at the time Nash was just named really as one of the respondents in the cab case, but to be able to show the links with the Keane gang was interesting. And of course, the Keane gang, Kieran Keane was the original leader of that gang. He was murdered in a spectacular double cross in 2003, conducted by the Dundon gang, which really made their name and put them onto the scene in a big way. And followed by that, his brother Christy Keane took it over. Christy Keane has survived a number of assassination attempts. He is a kind of a quiet criminal, isn't he? You don't really see him mouthing off or out and about too much.
No, he's been tipping away, I suppose, as they say. He, like in one sense, he was lucky enough during the height of the feud. He was actually serving a 10-year sentence. He was caught with, I think, a sack full of cannabis on the railway tracks close to his house. I don't know. And so he would have spent time. I mean, he ended up being friends with, I think it was John Daly from Finglas at one point. So you had a little crossover between some of the Keanes and some of the guys in Finglas at one point. But like he's been operating for years. I mean, he was shot and survived when was it 2016? And there are a number of people due. Well, there's one person left due to face trial on that in the Special Criminal Court. I think either later this year or early next year. But like, that was that seemed to me in the last, I suppose, the last event really in the feuding. I mean, there doesn't seem to have been anything since. Like, I remember in the lead up to when Christy Keane got shot, there had been a number of kind of incidents where kind of junior members of the gang were driving at each other and chasing each other around the city, and threats were being made on social media. But since then, it's been relatively quiet. I mean, there was a real fear that this is going to kick it all off again, but now we possibly know that at a higher level there was essentially cooperation going on between the top members of the gang, and it's all about making money. So I mean, that's been confirmed to us really essentially by what's come out, like from this investigation into Bow Motors.
I suppose the larger question that remains around it is kind of like, in Limerick, was Limerick a success story in policing? Because I suppose the policing and the amount of policing that went into it did quell the feud. You have seen key figures like Wayne and John Dundon are behind bars for life, and others. But the same gangs are there in the background, despite the rejuvenation of the estates, despite everything. I mean, it seems a lot of these gangs, the family gangs, it's coming down the generations. It's very difficult to, in any way, shape, or form, make a difference, isn't it, with that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's something that I say we share with, all countries across any Western, states where you have a family, a crime clan, essentially. When you think about it, like, it's the perfect organized crime unit, that you have a bunch of people who are tied to each other, and on the basis that you're related to someone is you're less likely to rat them out, or you're more likely to accept the authority of the person in charge, and you understand the history of where you're coming from. And then it also gives you a bit of kind of moral justification that you're not just doing this for yourself and you're not just a nasty criminal, that you're actually part of something bigger. No more than, say, a political prisoner, would find it in one sense easier to do their time because they know that, there's people out there who support them and believe in them. And similarly, I think with kind of the family-based kind of crime clans, it's a similar thing. Like it's sure it's the same with the Italian mafia and so on. That when you have these kind of family-based groups, it is going to lead to a kind of a continuation, and that power will maybe change between various individuals, and the wealth might move around a little bit as people go to jail or assets are seized. But I mean, what's the alternative? Let these gangs get even more powerful and more dangerous? Because I mean, it has been a success, and I mean, there hasn't been any killings. I mean, it was a shocking time, I think, in Limerick, where it was considered normal, or not that it was considered normal, but that people would be shocked but not surprised that there had been another murder. And when you look back at some of the people who were killed, they were all relatively minor street criminals, like, the people who were involved in crime, not the innocent people who were shot for either, pointless revenge attacks in one case and mistaken identity in another. But like, some of the criminals were like, these are guys who didn't own a car. Like, they were traveling around on sulkies or using their bicycle to get around. They weren't particularly wealthy. And yet at the same time, there was already, you could see the beginnings of, with the Dundons using their kind of UK connections and, to bring in more, criminals that carry out hits that wouldn't be recognized by the locals. And so you had that, early kind of indication that things had stepped up from what it had been, in the 1990s. I mean, going into the Celtic Tiger, it was just the amount of money that was sloshing around. And some of them obviously didn't really have the sophistication to kind of turn that money into greater power. And what we have now, I think, I suppose, is it'd be an early a way of looking at it. It's like the market has matured or something in Limerick, and that the gangs have, become better at what they're doing. And so this, in a sense, this board of governors is, the next wave of people are guys we're never going to hear about, quite possibly.
What I find about Limerick, though, is like, if something happens this week in Limerick, I and you know exactly where to go, where to turn when you pull into the city, which house to go to. They're still where they were 20 years ago. They're still within the communities. There's no easy answer to that. Some of them are still in council houses that we can readily identify as people running and being heavily involved in organised crime gangs. And they're left within those communities. They're still there. They haven't changed. They're not changing anything for the next generation. They're not like the American mafia, who many of them sort of
poshed their way out of organised crime by educating their kids, and they just don't seem to have the sophistication, or is it the education or something to do that?
Look, it's a hard one to answer, really. I mean, you can't necessarily say that about all of them. There would be individuals that would have started at the bottom, so to speak, who have, moved up and out to some extent. People who've gone on to set up businesses. I mean, look, it comes down to, like, you're going to have willing participants in crime in socially deprived areas, because it's the role model to look up to for young boys, young men. You have people, like, with low expectations, essentially, and, haven't been given a kind of a brighter horizon to look towards. Now, some people are able to find it for themselves. Some families do step up, and, there are family members who do, show a path out. But there are others then who, I think there's definitely people there who have the capacity and the intellect to move on, but don't want to. And they've chosen this life. And I mean, Christy Kinnan Sr. is a perfect example of that. This is, there's people who choose this way of life. They like it. They like that kind of, that sense of power, even freedom or anarchy. And they dress it up and justify it in their own heads in various different ways that, I'm truly free because I'm not adhering to the norms of society and this kind of thing, and
I'm more intelligent than following, like sheep, the laws and the rules.
Yeah, there's all that, and I mean, it's easy to do, but there's definitely people out there who are addicted to the game and they enjoy that, and and are able to square off the effect that it has on their own families, and for all the younger kids that come through, there's some that don't. There's some that don't make it. I mean, drug addiction, across Ireland is a problem. How many, members of crime families who aren't tough enough or smart enough or, just can't handle the stress or pressure or don't enjoy the life and can't really turn around and talk to people who should be there to support them, saying, like, I don't want any part of this. Mm-hmm. You can't turn on your own. So they're kind of stuck in a vicious circle. So, I mean, it's a deeper criminology type area to get into, like, but it's all those factors, really, plus the fact that there's all the nice middle class journalists and whatever else are still going out to buy their cocaine. He's keeping things going.
Well, absolutely.
Not us.
Blue in the face saying that, but I mean, it's also probably why this is not an issue. People often say, put more guards there, whatever. This isn't just an issue for the guards. Like, I mean, there's all those social structures that are going on that create this situation. There's lack of opportunities, lack of amenities in the education system sometimes to catch kids that are about to fall through the cracks. So it really seems to me it has to be a multi-agency approach to any of it. And probably that's what happened in Limerick in the Rejuvenation Project. And I suppose, like anything, we don't see the successes necessarily because they have, done it quietly.
Yeah. I mean, good news doesn't sell. No. I mean, to be brutal about it. I mean, and we do concentrate on the negative and the bad stuff. And I think, as humans, we're hardwired to do that. Like, I mean, nobody stops to look at a car being driven properly, but if it goes into a tree, we all stop to have a look, and it's just a matter of...
With the criminals, it's kind of like, I mean, okay, we're only really periphery. We're writing about them. We're sort of gaining a knowledge about them so as we can speak about them. Imagine policing this and just 20 years later, still going to the same doors and still realizing that these same people are the same cancer they were on the community that they were 20 years ago. It's you get tired and people get really sort of cynical and tired. It's a hard fight, isn't it?
I suppose, like, I mean, you go into these things as a younger guard, I imagine, or, certainly as a younger journalist thinking, oh, this is going to change. And then you kind of, as, 20 years later, we're looking and talking about the same people, to a large extent. But, like, it's a long game, like, and I mean, like, to go back to the long game, boring stuff about changing things. I mean, that's the problem. It's, if you're setting up all these, if you're setting stuff up to try and organize an alternative way out for people, it involves really boring stuff. It, involves, like, having a breakfast club and after school homework and sports teams being, given a certain amount of funding and development officers coming in, helping people to join bands, making sure literacy levels are at the right level and, educating young mothers on how to cook properly or something. There's all this stuff that is just so time consuming, and I mean, and then, guys who end up in prison or women who end up in prison, that is not, a matter of warehousing. I mean, there's so much drugs in prison. Like it's difficult to stop. I mean, the Irish Prison Service have made huge inroads, in fairness to them, in recent years, about the amount of stuff getting through. But there's determined criminals trying to get stuff in, and there's no rest for the wicked in that sense. Like, people aren't necessarily left alone to get on with it. And it's just, it needs a kind of a whole approach that I think would have to change at least 50% of the Irish population's mindset that, we don't want to be making life, easy for them. But it's, in the long run, it probably saves a lot of money. I mean, you hear about the stuff about, say, in Norway, where Andre Breivard's, the far-right fascist that killed 77 young people. And you kind of say, no, he's too dangerous to put into a normal prison. He'll corrupt other prisoners with his ideology. So they've locked him up in a landing where everybody on the landing is actually staff. And some of them just walk around the place, have a game of pool with each other. They're in the background. So it's to give him the sense that he's in a normal prison, and he's not. So, I mean, can you imagine doing that in Ireland, like the cost of, the sheer cost of that? But maybe, is that how a mature society deals with the worst possible human being you have? What do you do?
Yeah, there's definitely no easy answers to any of it. But look, we're plugging away, everybody is, and particularly the Criminal Assets Bureau. They're weeding the garden week in, week out. And if they didn't, can you imagine what the situation would be like? And if all the cops out there who weren't doing the regular day-to-day policing, can you imagine what it would be like? Because it just doesn't bear thinking if these people were given a free run at it. There's an underlying investigation going on in the background in Limerick. We report on it sometimes. There's constant raids happening on homes belonging to people who are senior in these gangs. And I think there's very much active investigations going on down there that we'll be talking about, no doubt, in the near future. But the Board of Governors, named and shamed.
For once.
Thank you very much, Eamon Dillon.
Thanks, Nicola.